Let's start with a basic test to see some of the foundational tools we'll be using in LiveView. So we're going to start very simple. We're going to test that some text is rendered in a LiveView. So if you look at your router, you'll see that we're mounting a Greet Live in Greet. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up. Go ahead to open your Greet Live. And as you can see, it already has some stuff going on there, but it's pretty simple. What are we doing here? We're rendering some text conditionally. So let's take a look at the mount really quick. If our LiveView is connected, we're going to have this live flag be true. And if it's disconnected, we're going to have that live flag be false. Now, if you're familiar with LiveView, we have a live cycle. So first there's a stateless HTTP request that goes through, and then the LiveView upgrades the WebSocket connection and re-renders a page. And so that's kind of what we're seeing here. So when it's connected, we have this live true here, and we render a text that says, "Welcome to testing LiveView." When it's disconnected, that initial request, it'll say, "Welcome to stateless HTTP." So we want to go ahead and test this just to get acquainted with things. So let's go ahead and open up our test. We're going to open up our test in test, Ranger Web, live, Greet Live test. Now you might see there that we have a Greet Live done test. That's if you want to see how at the end of the lesson all the tests that we write now, there should be available there. But you can check that out later. For now, let's go ahead and open this up. Now, since this is our first test, let's go ahead and talk about a little bit about the setup. First of all, we always use this con case, application web's con case. That's because we need the connection struct in order to mount the LiveView, and so we're always going to use this, much like in controller test if you're familiar. Then we import Phoenix LiveViewTest. This is crucial. This is going to give us all the helpers we need to mount the LiveView, to interact with the LiveView, to make assertions about the LiveView. So this is where all the good stuff is. But that's basically it. Now we can go ahead and write some tests. Let's start by testing that we are rendering the disconnected state. Let's see how we do that. We'll take the connection struct here. And if you've done any controller testing, this should look familiar. So let's assign this to a disconnected value. We'll take the connection struct and we'll do a get request. Once we have that disconnected value, we can assert something about it. We're going to do the HTML response of that disconnected state. It should be a 200. And in there, we should see, "Welcome to stateless HTTP." Perfect. Let's go ahead and run this test. Now, if you've never run Elixir test before, you do that with mixed test and the path to the file. So in this case, for example, test, Ranger Web, live, Greet Live test. And you can specify which test by adding a colon and a line inside that test. So it could be anywhere from 6 to 10 in my case. I'm going to go ahead and type 6 just to get us familiarized with this. Perfect. There we go. I'm also going to typically run my tests with a command from Vim. So if you see me doing something like this and the test automatically gets run, that's because I'm doing that. Perfect. So we can see that the test is passing, but let's double check that that's actually the case. I'm going to go ahead and open up Greet Live, and I'm going to go ahead and delete that and rerun the test. So this should fail now. And sure enough, we have a whole bunch of HTML, but the "Welcome to stateless HTTP" is not there. So our test is doing what we expect. I'll go ahead and run it again just to get a pass. So that's how we test the disconnected state. But what about the connected state? Well, let's go ahead and see how we can upgrade the connection. Take the connection struct. And what we're going to do is we're going to do something very similar. I'll copy this. But now we're going to use a live helper. And this comes from Phoenix LiveViewTest. So I'm going to go ahead and do live and pass in the disconnected state. And that will upgrade the connection. Now this live helper returns a 3 tuple. It'll return an OK, a view, and we'll look into this in a little bit more, and then some HTML. Now this is the HTML blob that's rendered when the LiveView connects. So that's the HTML that we're interested in. Since the HTML is already a blob, we don't need to do this HTML response. We can simply assert that in that HTML, we should see "Welcome to testing LiveView." So I'll go ahead and run the test. Excellent. The test is passing. Now, typically, we don't really care about testing the disconnected state. That's something more that you do in controller tests or things like that. So the live helper comes with a two-arity function. So let's go ahead and test that. And I'll go ahead and copy a lot of this. But rather than making the request first, we can let the live helper do all of that for us. And all we do is pass in the path as the second argument. So in this case, it's just a con. And we can run that test. And there we go, it passes. So this is typically how we test LiveView. We go directly to the connected state. Now, what about that view? We'll go into a lot more depth as we go through the lessons, but for now, I want you to know that that view is a struct that we're going to interact a lot with. It really has a lot of information, so let's go ahead and assert that that information is there. We'll render with a view, and now let's grab the view and ignore the HTML for now. What's in here? First of all, that view is a struct that has the module, so if you ever need the module, we should have this here. It also has the process ID of the LiveView, so that's something that is really helpful if you ever want to send messages to the LiveView, for example. Though that's a little low level, but we'll talk about that in future videos. There we go. And finally, since we can always re-render the LiveView based on its current state, we can render that view. And that'll give us the blob of HTML as it's rendered. And so we can make that same assertion against that. Let's go ahead and run that test. And it passes. Perfect. So, like I said, there's a lot more that we're going to do with this view, but these are the fundamentals of how we're interacting with LiveView. And I want you to see that live helper is sort of the gate that opens up how we're going to test LiveView. I'll see you in the next lesson.